First of all, and as highlighted by David and Maria, it's been a very interesting journey over the last year or so, from the very early stages of collaboration and then really coming together for this launch this morning. What is the state of Africa's financial markets? Who's the most open and transparent? How best to engage in a discussion around this topic that helps move sort of the broader project forward? What is openness anyway, and how do you measure it? So for those of you who have been leafing through the report, you'll see that really we're trying to reflect sort of a wide range of countries and a very wide variety of indicators. And the point of that is to sort of reflect that there might not just be one approach, and there's not just going to be a handful of measures that deliver the answers that we're looking for. More importantly, provide sort of that environment where we're able to engage not only this morning, but engage over the days and months and years ahead to deliver an outcome for the continent. In this first edition, you'll see that we've got 17 countries in our index. Thinking with my Economist hat on, they represent, in sort of the IMF, PPP, GDP world, they represent about 60% of the output of the continent. But probably when we think about financial markets, it really is the lion's share of where there are developments in that space. And there's a broad range. If you think about sort of just size of economies, Nigeria and Egypt on that same PPP measure, well in excess of $1 trillion. You will see we have Seychelles, and certainly I'm putting my hand up to be the person who introduces the index there. We have Seychelles, an economy of barely $3 billion. We have countries like South Africa, where the market cap, right, is sort of 4 times plus minus of GDP. We have other countries in the index like Mozambique, where developed markets are really about 10% of the economy. So it's a broad range and a broad range of indicators. And again, the idea is to deliver sort of a product that allows us to have a discussion. What about the measures themselves? So what we've tried to do here is make it kind of bite-sized in some way. So it's organized around what we call pillars, and there's 6 of them. And very briefly, sort of the first is in some sense, for a financial markets index, in some sense the most easy to understand. It's really around market depth. So in that space, we're looking at the product diversity. We're looking at sort of the size of markets. We're looking at liquidity. We're looking at whether they're primary dealers, et cetera. The second pillar that we have is around just access to foreign exchange, right? Are there capital restrictions? How do you report in that space? What does liquidity look like? Can you get sizable transactions, sizable as compared to the size of the economy and its needs? Can you get sizable transactions done? Market transparency as a pillar. So looking at regulatory and tax environments. Do countries subscribe to Basel, and if so, at sort of which level? For global accounting and reporting standards, which ones are used and how closely are they followed? What does a tax environment look like? What does sort of the market data reporting look like? Can you really see what's going on behind these markets? Do countries have credit ratings? What does the protection look like for minority investors? Then we're looking at sort of the capacity of locals investors itself, because it's all well and good to have sort of developed financial markets, but these are not meant to just be the playthings of foreign investors and foreign capital. So what is the development look like in these countries of the local pension sector? What about local insurance firms? So how much depth there exists on both sides of that market? The 5th pillar is around the macro opportunity, and as a macroeconomist, this feels a little bit closer to home in many cases, and it starts with the obvious stuff, right? It starts thinking about economic growth and sort of levels of development for the economy as a whole, but then quickly gets us much closer to this discussion around our transparency and openness. So does a country subscribe to a particular data standard? What is the quality and the breadth of the data that exists out there? Key releases, like budgets, monetary policy decisions. Are they, do you know the dates of these things beforehand? Are the outcomes communicated clearly? As sort of a participant in those markets, do you have a good sense of what's going on? What about debt? Are countries being run in a sustainable fashion, or are troubles likely to come up? What is the soundness of the bank? So all of those things sit there really in that macroeconomic pillar. And then the final pillar is around the legal environment. It thinks about insolvency frameworks. It thinks about netting, collateral, and sort of other indicators in that space. Now, you'll see by its very nature, and so there's 6 pillars, more than 40 indicators. Some of that stuff is pretty quantitative, right? We can pull it down from a website. Other of that stuff is much more interactive, approaching regulators and other people in those industries to try to understand what the right answer is. And some of it, quite frankly, is very subjective. And so the goal with having so many indicators is to be able to sort of make sure that no particular one is very dominant. We went out and spoke to more than 60 top executives representing sort of banks and investors, security exchanges and regulators, auditing and accounting firms, and of course the international and development institutions. So there's an awful lot of input that comes together in this African Financial Market Index. The goal here, of course, is not, and it's always tempting when we're talking about Africa, the goal here is not to create a report that slips into thinking about economic transformation or economic development on the continent. There are plenty of those out there. Our lens is very much through financial markets, openness, and transparency. Likewise, you don't want to get confused here with rankings on competitiveness. We have that from the World Economic Forum. We don't want that ease of doing business. The guys down the road do a superb job on those sorts of things. We see already from the global consultancies work on Africa's attractiveness for foreign direct investment. This is not that. Rather, this is to put down a marker, right, for where Africans' financial markets sit today, to understand the variety of frameworks that exist out there, and then again to engage in that discussion. What are the key findings? Well, Maria already mentioned a few of them around sort of legal frameworks and around sort of the capacity of local investors and also some of the consistency of market data. But you also see in the first pages a couple other big takeaways. As David mentioned, the temptation always, the moment we put a list of countries in order, right, this whole thing looks like a medals table at the Olympics. And this is not that, but it would be wrong of me to suggest that we're not going to first look in that direction. So you will see, for example, that South Africa, right, has some distance as first place from number 2. But what becomes more interesting to me as a participant in putting this index together is the clustering that exists after that. So the gap between first and sort of second place, the most open and transparent markets to somewhat less open and transparent, the gap between first and second, well, that gap is actually larger than the gap between third and 14th. So there's lots of different permutations and ways that you, as a country, face off against these indicators. So that's clustering. South Africa itself, I might say, is also a pretty good indicator that if what we were worried about is generating an index that simply talks about the economy and economic development, well, you will not have escaped knowing that South Africa is going through a little bit of a difficult period right now. So if this was just an indicator of sort of macro progress, South Africa probably wouldn't be where it is. Likewise, for something like Mauritius, right? Very solid, right? Second in our index. A country that's very much focused on positioning itself to be sort of a gatekeeper for investments coming from the rest of the world and onto the continent. And in order to achieve that, Mauritius is very much focused around providing sort of the right legal framework. They've focused very much around sort of the tax environment, market transparency, small but very open, right? Successful and really focused on it. A great indication of the sorts of things that we hope to encourage through the release and regular discussion around this dialogue. You see Kenya and Nigeria, right? Economic, but more importantly, financial hubs for East and West Africa, respectively, doing quite well in the index. And then you have countries like Ethiopia, right? Tremendous economic success from a very low base, top of mind for many direct investors that they look for where to put production facilities and others on the continent. But let's be frank, when we look across this from an Africa Financial Markets Index, when we're thinking about openness and transparency and opportunity in those markets, well, Ethiopia has an awful long way to go, and we hope that something like this will help promote those discussions. But this is very much at the top level of detail, and what's most interesting, I think, is the discussion when we get down within the pillars and within the countries. So you'll see that there's a wide variety of experiences. I'll use Morocco in North Africa as an example here. You'll see that the country scores as high as 5th when we think about market depth and macroeconomics. But when it comes to things like FX, foreign exchange, it's sort of quite near the bottom of the table. In the legal environment, dead last. So you can be very strong at some things. Other parts, you could use some development. But with that sort of little move into the detail, let me hand off to my collaborator, Danai, from OMFIF, who will talk through the pillars in a little bit more detail. Thank you.